My name is Brie Lemon. I'm cosplaying as Hela from Thor Ragnarok. This is my second cosplay that I've ever made. My first was Maleficent. I first got into cosplay about 2.5, 3 years ago or so. I'd always wanted to do it, but due to life restrictions, I just never really got into it. Maleficent's always been one of my most favorite characters, so I started kind of working on her as a just like a side project here and there. It took me about 2 years to get started, to actually get to her costume to the point where I wanted it to be, before I actually decided to take on something as crazy as doing Hela. Honestly, I have a thing with characters with horns. There's some sort of draw to me. There always has been since I was a small child. Characters with horns I've always been more drawn to than characters without horns. So I don't know why. It makes no sense to me, but I just kind of said, whatever, I'll just go with it. I absolutely love horns, and Hela has a bunch of horns. So as I saw the trailer for Thor Ragnarok, and as I started to research more about the character, I just fell in love with the whole goddess of death. It kind of ties in also with my whole Maleficent character. Just a really badass character that has a lot of attitude and a lot of confidence, which oddly enough is something I lack in my normal personal life. But something about putting on horns and a cape and, you know, big heels just kind of makes you feel like you can take over the world. Cosplay is incredibly empowering for me. I did Rocky Horror Picture Show for a couple of years. I played Dr. Frankenfurter. I didn't even want to be on the stage. I was backstage for 6 months before everyone insisted that I perform. And that's where I found out that dressing up in a costume makes me feel more empowered than I do in my everyday life. So dressing up as Maleficent, dressing up as Hela or as Dr. Frankenfurter makes me feel incredibly confident. It makes me feel more like myself than I do in my everyday life. I don't feel as insecure. I feel really badass, and I feel like I can totally take on the world. And if you don't like me, you guys can just go away. Don't really care. The horns were a labor of love and a labor of blood, sweat, and tears, quite literally. I added it up this morning. My horns took 297 hours roughly to make just the horns. Each one was originally made, I did a clay sculpt of the shape of the horn in a 4-dimensional form. So the larger horns that I have that actually curl up all the way to the top, those ones they move forward and backward and then curl around towards the front. And so I did those out of a clay sculpt in paper clay. And I sculpted one whole side, so 5 horns. And then I wrapped each horn individually in saran wrap, and then took newspaper strips soaked in 50% glue and 50% water, and did basically paper mache for each individual horn. They're between 20 and 25 layers of paper mache per horn. So, and that's each individual horn on all sides, and there's 10 horns. So once I had all of the paper mache done, I did an oven dry in between each layer, so to make sure it was super hardened before I started putting on the next layer. After that, I have a mannequin head form. I put a headband on it, so I had an initial structure to it. I did one layer of felt, which was fun to try to figure out the 3-dimensional form shapes that you need in order for it to fit a head. And after that, I did 2 layers of buckram. Buckram is a fabric. It's kind of like plaster of Paris fabric. So you soak it in water for a little bit to activate the plaster in it, and then you mold it around the head form, and then I did one more layer of felt on top of that. To attach the buckram to the felt, I did hot glue in between. It's the easiest way to quickly attach it and make sure that everything is formed smoothly. After I got the last layer of felt on, I had to go to each individual horn and cut it to the perfect shape to fit around the sculpt of the head. So each individual horn had to be perfectly cut and molded to fit around the head form and make shapes like this that also curve to the head. And once I had that shape cut out correctly, I took more paper mache and I made the ends of it solid. There were about 6 layers on the end of it just to make sure I had enough structure. Hot glue that to the felt, and then once I had all of the horns on in the right position and there was enough base of hot glue to give it structure so that they don't fall down, then I wrapped the whole base of the skull in leather, just garment leather, so it has a lot of pliable nature to it, and it's very, very smooth and flexible, so it can actually move easily with my head, and it doesn't hold a lot of heat in. After I wrapped all of that, then I actually did the texture on the individual horns. The horn texture is a 50-50 mix of black satin acrylic paint with a medium gel acrylic medium, and I just had a really, really old crappy brush that that was not good for much of anything, and it actually worked out perfectly to make the texture of the horns. Since it was such a frazzled brush, I put on about a layer about that thick or so of medium, and then just kept brushing it until it had the texture that I wanted, and let it dry. And so it was about 300 hours, just under 300 hours for the horns, and the leather harness was a whole different section that took about 18 hours to make. I've never made one before. I primarily do a lot of leather work on my own, but I'd never made a harness before, so I had to figure out all the angles and make sure that it would work with attaching the cape to the harness, and make sure all the trigonometry essentially would work with physics and gravitational pulls and all that fun stuff. So far, I was actually after the convention yesterday. There's a lot of drawbacks I found out. Main one being that when I positioned the initial headband for structure, I did not position it correctly. It was positioned directly on top of my ears. So last night I had to go in with a hot knife and cut out the headband that goes from here to about here-ish, because it was pushing directly on top of my ears. And I had to go through, there are a lot of things like with using hot glue, if it dries too quickly, you end up with bubbles. And when you have bubbles on the inside of the head with this much weight on it, even with paper mache, it still weighs about 5 pounds, which is a lot of weight on top of your head. It ends up pushing into different sections of your head, and it kind of hurts. So I had to go through and cut out different parts of that, reline it with a softer felt, and for over my ears, I actually had to cut out where my ears go and put a whole bunch of cotton balls in there, and then put felt over top of it so it has some squish over my ears so it's not completely squishing it. Another drawback, unfortunately, being at a very busy convention and being so wide, you kind of end up running into a lot of people, and these ones are still incredibly sharp. So I have to be really careful walking around, make sure I don't poke anybody in the eye, or going through doorways. That's also fun. So is going to the bathroom when you're a female and the bathroom lines are already long and you absolutely have to wait for the handicap stall because you won't fit in the regular stall. That's also super fun. Other than that, there's not too many drawbacks of this costume. It takes a little bit of getting used to with the balance and trying to make sure that you have enough clearance when you're walking around and the weight of it, but as long as you remember to stand up straight, there aren't too many drawbacks of it. It's kind of fun to wear. Character on my wish list to do next. I have a big wish list. The top two for me would definitely be either X-Men Mystique or Harley Quinn, obviously. However, they're both very, very overdone or only done in a very narrow way. Like Mystique is typically only done because she's blue. It's done with body paint, and it's done with the white outfit and the red wig. And I like to do things a little bit differently. I like things that are my own interpretation of a costume or a character without it being a direct replica. Same thing with my Maleficent cosplay. It's not a direct replica of it. It's my own interpretation, but it's still easily recognizable. And Harley Quinn is very, very overdone, but it's a character I've identified with since the cartoon came out in the 90s. So I've got a lot of different things in my brain simmering on how I want to try and do a different interpretation of Harley, especially because there are so many different Harley Quinn cosplays out there. I just want to try to find a way to do it that still honors the character. It's still recognizable, but it's my own personal take on it. Same thing with Mystique. I love Mystique, another one of the characters I've been in love with since the X-Men cartoons came out. I want to try to figure out a way to do that that's my own interpretation, but still recognizable and still unique.